You were constantly labeled as the source of shame, my relatives claimed, at every festive occasion. So when I purchased my ideal apartment, I organized a grand gathering and distributed invitations to all except them. They discovered it through social media. The reactions were delightful. I, aged 32, have perpetually been the outsider in my household. At each holiday event, every shared meal, every festivity, I was the individual they'd glance away from, whose accomplishments were overlooked, who inexplicably always succeeded in humiliating them simply by being present. As a child, my elder sibling was the favored one. Flawless academics, ideal position in father's bookkeeping company, perfect spouse, perfect offspring. My sibling wasn't much different, wedded early to an attorney, remained at home raising children, resided in the outskirts just as mother had always envisioned. Then came me, the person who left university to launch a personal venture, who resided in a tiny flat, who appeared at family occasions in casual pants while others donned formal attire. The remarks began young and persisted endlessly. Mother would present my siblings with enthusiasm, listing their successes, then reach me with an artificial grin and state I was still sorting life out. Father would inquire when I'd secure a legitimate occupation. My sibling would crack jokes regarding my way of living. My sibling would offer sympathetic glances and question if I required funds. The previous Thanksgiving marked the tipping point. I'd recently secured my largest customer so far, a technology company that desired me to manage their complete online promotion plan. The agreement was valued higher than my sibling's earnings over half a year, but as I attempted to announce it, Father interrupted me abruptly. He suggested that perhaps this instance I'd truly commit to it rather than leaping between various quick wealth ideas. My sibling chuckled and remarked at least somebody was prepared to compensate me for idling online. Mother simply sighed and shifted the topic to my nephew's sports competition. I remained seated, utensil paused en route to my lips, observing my relatives disregard the most significant career milestone of my existence as if it meant zero. My sibling bent closer and murmured that I ought not to interpret it personally. They merely fretted over me since I was perpetually the family's disgrace. She stated it as though it were an undeniable truth, something universally acknowledged. That evening, I reached a resolution. I was finished attempting to validate myself to individuals who'd already concluded I didn't merit their esteem. The customer I'd referenced proved to be all I'd anticipated and beyond. In under 3 months, they'd introduced me to 2 additional firms. By the warmer season, I possessed a queue of customers and was declining assignments. The small flat that had been a point of humiliation turned into my base, but it wouldn't suffice for long. I began scouting apartments in the priciest area of the town, not to demonstrate anything to anybody, but because I could at last manage the existence I'd always desired. The unit I discovered was all I'd imagined: tall windows facing the waterway, a contemporary cooking area with stone surfaces, 2 sleeping quarters with one transformed into an ideal workspace, and a terrace that captured the dusk each night. The initial payment exceeded what my parents had spent on their whole residence 3 decades prior. I finalized the documents on a weekday and received the access on the following one. Positioned in my vacant apartment, gazing at the urban horizon, I sensed something absent around my relatives for ages: self-respect. That's when the concept struck me. I'd always been informed I was the humiliation, the misfit, the one not to be regarded earnestly. But now I possessed something they couldn't ignore or belittle. I had triumph on my own conditions, and I intended to commemorate it appropriately. I devoted the subsequent fortnight organizing the ideal welcome event. Not merely any occasion, the type of affair that would clarify precisely how prosperously I was faring. I employed a food service firm expert in upscale corporate cuisine. I set up a mixologist skilled in crafting beverages pricier than typical meals. I even engaged a picture taker to document it all. The attendee roster was meticulously selected. My nearest companions, my professional networks, my patrons, my fellow residents, individuals who recognized me, valued me, and sincerely wished to honor my victory. I dispatched refined invites with raised print and response forms, the sort of invites my relatives would have ridiculed if they'd gotten them. But they didn't get them. For the initial time ever, my relatives weren't welcome to an event I was arranging. No parents, no sibling and his partner, no sibling and her spouse, no young relatives, no extended kin who devoted years remarking on when I'd mature and approach life earnestly. The event was set for a weekend night. I spent the prior day preparing, positioning items, ensuring each element was flawless. My companions arrived ahead to assist, and witnessing their eagerness made me understand how distinct this was from any family assembly I'd participated in. These folks were truly joyful for me. They desired to attend. By evening start, my apartment brimmed with joy and dialogue. The picture taker navigated the group, preserving instances of authentic festivity. My primary patron delivered a speech on how collaborating with me had revolutionized their enterprise. My adjacent resident noted she'd been boasting to her acquaintances about the prosperous innovator who'd relocated nearby. I shared images during the night. The array of prepared dishes, the scenery from my terrace, clusters of companions toasting in honor. Each share received numerous approvals and responses from individuals felicitating me on the fresh home and the evident triumph of the event. The finest image was captured mid-evening. I stood in my main room, encircled by companions, grasping a flute of bubbly and truly beaming. The urban glows sparkled beyond through those expansive panes, and all aspects of the picture conveyed prosperity and joy. I shared it with a basic note on appreciating fine companions and fresh starts. That's when my device began alerting. My sibling was the initial to ring. I allowed it to voice message. Then my sibling, then mother. I disregarded them all and concentrated on my visitors, but I could observe the alerts accumulating on my display. The initial message arrived from my sibling late evening. She'd viewed the images and demanded to know why she wasn't welcome to my welcome event. She remarked the location appeared fantastic, and she couldn't fathom I hadn't informed the relatives about acquiring an apartment. My sibling's message was blunter. He questioned if I was truly hosting an event without including kin. He stated mother was distressed, and father was puzzled about why I was concealing my resident status. But it was the responses on my social shares that truly narrated the tale. My companions and coworkers were posting complimentary notes, discussing the wonderful experience they'd enjoyed, commending the lovely area and the flawless event. Interspersed with those were responses from distant kin who'd spotted the shares via shared links. My relative inquired why she hadn't been aware I'd purchased a home. My aunt noted that the apartment appeared astonishing, and she was immensely proud of my progress. My uncle, who'd always been the loudest about my absence of focus, posted a response stating he had no clue I'd been so prosperous and inquiring when he could visit personally. Each response from kin felt like a minor triumph. These were folks who'd devoted years viewing me as a flop, and now they were witnessing proof that I'd constructed something remarkable without their awareness. The rings persisted over the days off. Mother left a recording stating she was pained that I hadn't revealed such major updates with the kin. She mentioned they'd have adored joining the festivity, and she didn't comprehend why I was excluding them. Father's note was briefer but sharper. He stated he'd seen the images and desired to know how I'd managed such a costly location. He questioned if I was burdened with loans or if I'd engaged in something dubious to earn that sum rapidly. My sibling rang the next morning, and I eventually responded. He mentioned the kin were intending to travel and view the location, perhaps dine out to honor correctly. I informed him I was occupied with tasks and couldn't accommodate guests. He insisted, claiming it would be brief, but I stayed resolute. He ultimately asked outright why I hadn't welcomed them to the event. I revealed the reality. I stated that for ages, whenever I'd attempt to disclose positive updates or honor a milestone, the kin had discovered methods to undermine or ignore it. I'd been termed a humiliation so frequently that I'd begun accepting it. This event was about honoring with individuals who truly backed me and trusted in my endeavors. He paused silently for a while before suggesting perhaps I was overreacting, that kin were meant to jest with one another, and that all were proud even if they didn't express it ideally. I requested him to recall one occasion in the recent half-decade when any kin had sincerely praised my feats without jesting or doubting my decisions. He couldn't reply. The social media responses continued arriving all week. What began as a basic honor share had evolved into something larger. Companions were mentioning others, coworkers were recounting experiences of collaborating with me, and the interaction was unprecedented for my shares. But the kin responses were what truly drew my focus. My aunt had reposted one of my images to her profile with a note on her immense pride in her relative's triumph. Several of her acquaintances responded inquiring about me, and she replied with enthusiastic accounts of my venture and new home. My relative, whom I hadn't conversed with in over 12 months, messaged privately seeking guidance on initiating her venture. She mentioned she'd been unaware of my prosperity and wondered if I'd guide her. Most unexpectedly, my sibling's spouse responded on various images inquiring about the decor expert I'd employed and the complex facilities. When I explained I'd handled all the styling personally and investigated the complex thoroughly prior to purchase, she appeared truly amazed. The difference was notable. Distant kin who scarcely knew me were honoring my triumph and requesting greater involvement, while my close kin concentrated on their exclusion from the event. Midweek night, Mother arrived at my complex without notice. The entrance staff rang to inquire if I anticipated her, and I nearly declined. But interest prevailed, and I permitted her entry. She positioned at my entrance, surveying the corridor with clear astonishment. She remarked that the structure was far superior than anticipated and questioned if I was certain I could handle the regular charges plus the loan. I welcomed her inside, and observing her response to my apartment was both gratifying and melancholic. She traversed each space gradually, absorbing the features, posing queries about the devices and the scenery. She appeared truly amazed but also perplexed, as if she couldn't align this prosperity with her view of me as the kin letdown. She inquired how long I'd been intending to acquire a home and why I hadn't disclosed it. I clarified that I'd been pursuing this aim for ages, but each attempt to discuss my venture expansion or monetary advancement, the discussion was halted or jested about. She claimed that wasn't accurate, that the kin were always curious about my activities. I recalled particular events. The Thanksgiving when father ignored my major customer, the holiday when my sibling jested about my online venture, the spring event when she'd inquired about rent assistance publicly. She remained silent briefly, gazing at the water scenery. Eventually, she conceded that perhaps the kin hadn't been as encouraging as needed. She mentioned they fretted because my route differed from their comprehension and concerns sometimes emerged as judgment. I valued the recognition, but I also highlighted that their concern had evolved into a habit of disregard spanning years. I'd ceased disclosing positive news, anticipating adverse replies. She inquired if I intended to remove the kin from my existence completely. I stated that wasn't my intent, but I wouldn't continue exposing myself to settings where my feats were downplayed and decisions perpetually challenged. Prior to departing, she requested if she could escort father to view the location. I said I'd consider it. The social media share had developed independently. A nearby style influencer had discovered it and contacted requesting to highlight my apartment in a piece on youthful innovators in the area. A property broker responded inquiring if I'd like to appear in their promotional content as an achievement tale. My venture was gaining too. 3 prospective patrons had connected after viewing the shares and discovering my work via responses. One particularly noted they were amazed by my clear prosperity and desired collaboration with someone evidently flourishing. But the kin's circumstances were becoming intricate. My sibling had begun responding to my shares frequently, posting notes on his pride and eagerness to visit personally. The abrupt shift in attitude was startling after years of belittling remarks. My sibling adopted another tactic. She began reposting pieces on prosperous innovators on her profiles, mentioning me in shares about individuals who'd created ventures from scratch. It seemed staged, as if attempting to link publicly with my triumph after years of viewing it as shameful. The most intriguing progress was from father. He'd never participated in social platforms, but he'd evidently set up a profile solely to track me and approve my shares. Mother noted in a call that he'd been posing specific queries about my venture structure and customer group. She mentioned he'd confessed to her that he'd never grasped my occupation, and witnessing proof of my prosperity had prompted him to recognize he ought to have inquired more rather than assuming. That days off, my sibling arrived at my complex with his spouse and children. They hadn't notified, just emerged in the entrance and requested announcement. When I descended to greet them, my sibling claimed they'd been nearby and wished to check my availability for a short stop. I knew it was false. My structure was distant from their usual spots, but I was interested in their true intent. I escorted them upstairs, and observing my young relatives explore the area while my sibling's spouse captured images was bizarre. My sibling devoted the whole stop to querying about my venture he'd previously ignored. He desired details on my customer-gaining method, fee structure, expansion ideas. He even inquired if I'd contemplated growing and recruiting staff. When his spouse shared images from the stop on her profile, noting the spot and praising my remarkable triumph, I grasped the situation. My kin weren't merely seeking reconciliation, they were attempting to link themselves with my triumph openly. The responses on her share were revealing. Their acquaintances were inquiring about me, amazed by the apartment and interested in my venture. Multiple individuals noted they were unaware my siblings' kin were linked to such a prosperous innovator. I was uncertain how to react. Portion of me was content they were ultimately recognizing my feats, but another was irritated that it required such clear, irrefutable proof of prosperity for them to regard me earnestly. 3 weeks post-event, my kin interactions had entirely transformed. The identical individuals who devoted years viewing me as the shame were now aiming to present as my primary backers. My sibling had initiated a collective discussion with distant kin, distributing news on my venture and reposting images from my profile. She designated herself as my informal promoter, which was ironic given she'd been among my sternest judges. Father had astonished all by inquiring if he could fund my venture. At a kin meal I'd eventually consented to join, he'd drawn me aside and stated he'd been studying online promotion firms and believed mine possessed substantial expansion promise. He desired to know if I'd accept a quiet associate. The proposal was appealing financially, but I was cautious of blending kin and work, particularly with our background. I informed him I'd ponder it, but internally I worried about relational impacts if the venture faced difficulties. My sibling had chosen another path. He'd begun directing customers from his bookkeeping company to me, and some became major deals. He'd also started seeking my guidance on his profession, pondering if he should depart father's company to establish his own. The most striking shift was in treatment at kin assemblies. Abruptly, I was the desired conversationalist. Relatives who'd scarcely noticed me previously were querying about my venture. Extended kin were presenting me to their circles as their prosperous relative. My feats were being honored rather than ignored, but the affirmation seemed empty. These were the same folks who'd caused me to feel unsuccessful for ages, and now they were treating me as a victory narrative, due to a fine apartment and some social images proving my value. The genuine challenge occurred at a kin outdoor meal at my parents' residence. I was positioned in the rear yard, observing my nephews engage, when I caught my sibling conversing with our relative about me. She was outlining my venture triumph and apartment. But then she appended that she'd always believed I'd resolve matters soon, that the kin had perpetually backed my innovative drive. It was a full revision of past events, and it prompted me to recognize that fundamentals remained unchanged. My kin still couldn't admit their errors about me. Instead, they were feigning perpetual support. I resolved to confront it openly. At the meal, when father began boasting to the group about my recent customer gain, I halted him. I stated I valued the backing, but I wished to recognize it hadn't always existed. I recalled to all the years of judgment, the belittling remarks, the ongoing hints that I required a proper occupation. The group fell silent. Mother appeared uneasy. My sibling gazed at his dish. My sibling attempted to dismiss it humorously, claiming kin always jest, and that I was overreacting to ancient quips. I informed them that labeling someone a shame wasn't jesting and undermining their feats wasn't playful. I stated I was thankful they were ultimately regarding my triumph earnestly, but I also required them to recognize that their prior behavior had been painful and unjust. Father spoke first. He conceded he'd erred in ignoring my venture for so long, and that he'd allowed his incomprehension to become unjust judgment. He stated he was proud of my creation and regretful for the delay in recognition. My sibling continued, admitting he'd jested at my cost due to envy of my autonomy and bravery and risks. He mentioned he'd always chosen safety and had envied my self-bet. My sibling was more guarded, but she ultimately conceded she'd fretted about me and conveyed that fret in manners that likely seemed aggressive. She stated she'd never intended to cause me to feel shameful. Mother wept slightly and stated she regretted not being more encouraging, that she'd been fearful of my failure, and had attempted to safeguard me by promoting conventional paths. It wasn't an ideal settlement, but it was sincere, and for the first time in ages, I sensed my kin were truly perceiving me as myself, not their envisioned version. The social share that initiated it all was still receiving sporadic responses and approvals. But crucially, it had compelled a dialogue long delayed. I demonstrated to myself and kin that I could prosper on my terms, and I discovered that occasionally the optimal method to alter treatment is to cease tolerating mismatch with your value. My apartment stayed my haven, the tangible evidence of all I'd constructed sans their aid or consent. But now it also represented another aspect. The instant I'd ceased being the kin shame and begun being one who required esteem. The retribution had been more gratifying than anticipated, but the harmony that ensued had been even more precious. Sometimes you must omit people from your triumph before they can genuinely value your accomplishments.